Hi, I just wondered if you could say something around leadership's relationship to learning from failure and whether that happens as much as it maybe should, or what you thought about that.
Who wants to take that question?
Well, I'll have a go, and then somebody else can have a think and say something much more insightful afterwards. Learning from failure, I think it is hard for people to do it, and the approach that we take, that I take with colleagues in my organisation, is to try to do two things at once, in a way, to give people the opportunity to apply the considerable benefit of hindsight to rebuild what they might do in the future, or they might have done, at the same time as reflecting on what went wrong. And that way, I suppose, two things emerge. One is people feel a bit better about themselves because they're given the opportunity to deploy their skills and expertise that they've gained through the failure to saying what they might do in the future and what others might want to do in the future, as well as having a frank conversation about where things have gone wrong. And I guess one of the examples of that, if that's helpful, is an exercise that I did with colleagues, which was a review of the construction of a building using social investment, which was unfamiliar and new to everybody. It was a collaborative exercise. We all know collaboration's hard. It required considerable leadership from people, organisations, and kind of coalitions of people. And that's exactly what we did. We deconstructed the steps, and then we reconstructed it collectively, so that what they had at the end was an honest appraisal of the moments where things had not been well led, or not badly led, but could have been led better. But also they ended with a pathway to how things might be done differently in the future. So that's my take.
I think the best way is to illustrate my answer by a small sort of story. In 2004, I was involved in organizing an event, and two of our speakers were Muslims. I don't know if you are familiar with sandwiches. If you go to eat, we had sandwiches earlier. So I'm glad to say we scored very highly today. But on this particular occasion, I went in the room. I mean, my colleagues had organized lunch, obviously. I wasn't involved, I have to say. I have to raise my hand and say no. And I discovered that all the sandwiches were serving had ham. So it's a room full of people. So we had soup, all right, but you know, the people who didn't eat ham would have to have only soup, no sandwiches. So then somebody pulled me out and said, okay, Fidèle, I mean, how could you get it wrong? And I said, actually, I was involved in organizing. I got you here, but I wasn't involved in organizing the food. So as a result of that, when we went back to the office, we said to ourselves, something went wrong. So what do we do to make sure it doesn't happen in the future? So in the team in planning, and I know Janet went at length to make sure everything was all right, we would also have a task force to look at the food to make sure we got things right. So one is asking people if they have any dietary preferences, if they have allergies, and so forth. If it had not happened, I would have naturally gone to function expecting things to work for everybody. But on this particular occasion, it didn't work. So in a way, it reflects what you were talking about in my workshop, which was looking at diversity. It's how do we plan, do we do universal planning for what we do to make sure that everybody who comes in actually feel catered for, whether it is, accessibility in terms of physical, but also accessibility in terms of people who have got visual impairments, people who have who can't speak and so forth. So how inclusive are we? I mean, it is a question we should be asking ourselves for whatever we do as a result of my experience in 2004.
Great. Got questions?
Thank you. Hello, Helen Britton speaking. I'll hold this a little further away. Today has actually precipitated A few questions, but I just want to put one to the panel there. And what strikes me throughout the day is this. Is there an inherent contradiction in the area of leadership and collaboration? Or does it just highlight the need for different models? So, for example, leadership as collaboration or leadership as system. And I'm sort of specifically thinking on the latter in terms of its connection then with policies and practices, etc. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that to go on quite that long and complicated.
Question for Siv. If you don't mind.
Leadership as collaboration or leadership as a system. I think that what's interesting about today is just flagging up that there are so many different ways of understanding leadership, and also very many different ways of understanding collaboration, and therefore different ways of understanding collaborative leadership as well. And I'm going to waffle my way out of this one. I know I will, if you bear with me. I think that often when you say collaboration, people assume it's a sort of, it's shared values, it's all in agreement, it's about trust and all that. And I'm not sure that that's right. I think that we have situations where we collaborate out of necessity, and we collaborate even if we don't trust, and we collaborate even if we don't have equal power, and we collaborate because we need to in order to address an issue. And I think, therefore, it's very difficult to say whether there is a contradiction or not. Like, there could be. So one of the things we talked about in the workshop that I ran was different ways of understanding the context and what your sphere of influence is and what that implies in terms of leadership. So if you're thinking about a partnership as a collaboration, and you in a position as a coordinator or a manager, so your role is to coordinate the activities of the partners, then you have a leadership role, and it's quite easy to understand what your sphere of influence is and how you need to act in order to move that collaboration forward. But equally, you could be a participant in that collaboration representing your organization, and so you're taking a leadership role on behalf of your organization, in which case you have a very interesting situation as to what it is that you're trying to influence and who it is that you are leading on behalf of. And, you know, I could go on talking about it in this way. I think it's really important to understand the context and what it is that you're trying to do, and then think about what's a possible way of understanding leadership. We also talked about the tensions that are involved in leadership and how in collaborative context there usually isn't one right way of moving forward. You know, there are always pluses and minuses with different ways of acting, even if it comes down to encouraging somebody to talk about what it is they want to get out of a collaboration, for example. Because if you talk about aims and remits and values too much, you risk unearthing some differences that you can't move away from. And at the same time, if you don't address that issue enough, then people will have different perception of what it is that they're trying to achieve. So if leadership is about creating a direction, then you have a tension there just in how you speak about it. I'm going to shut up because I could go on for a long time.
You want to say
I think
yeah.
it's a good question. So with a couple of colleagues at the moment, we're working on an idea that we're working with democracy and leadership. And we had a PhD student look at the very small literature that discusses democratic leadership, but in the sense of a practice rather than something formal in a state or whatever. And actually what she found was something really interesting in the literature, which is either the word democracy was used as a placeholder for something else, like a bit of shared influence or involvement or something. Or that, again, it kept coming back to the individual. There are ways that you as a person can be more democratic. So we found this very unsatisfactory because it's neither being very democratic nor being very leaderful, really. So we come to a position where maybe the two things do need to be kept in tension, yeah, as a kind of organizational paradox. And maybe the excitement is in the tension between them rather than trying to put the two things together. I wanted to come back quickly on failure because I think that's such an important point. Too often, I think we try to learn from whiz-bang leaders. We've had some of that, a little bit of that today, but it's far more, and there's a guy called, a prof up in Lancaster called David Collinson who's developed a theory of Prozac leadership, and it's a catchy title, but what he means by that is a kind of a synthetic positivity that seeps into leadership thinking and leadership practice. And it can be encapsulated by something we call the Hitler problem, right? Which is when someone asks a leadership scholar, okay, so can you therefore explain using your theory of transformational, whatever, authentic leadership, why was Hitler a bad leader? And the answer is, of course, he wasn't a leader. He doesn't qualify for leadership. Therefore, the whole construct of leadership, according to lots of theories, dominant theories, I'd say, just they deal with the negative by excluding it. The effect of that is it closes down learning, doesn't it? So you can't learn from, big monstrous failings like Hitler or whatever, but equally you can't learn from the ambiguous either. So one of the best papers I've read in this area is about a Hungarian Jewish leader during the war, and I can't remember his name, and I think it's Krasner. Anyway, but the whole point of this leader is he took horrible decisions about who would survive, trying to do deals with the Nazis. I think his aim was to try to save some people. And of course, operating from a basis of lack of information, because it's easy for us looking back decades later to say, oh, how naive he was. Of course, at the time, he didn't know. Anyway, but the point of this paper is it brings out kind of this awful situation with a bloke and a team of people around him, trying to make sense through a very ambiguous and emotionally terrifying situation. And you can learn a lot more, I think, from people, failures and successes in these kind of ambiguous situations, I think, than you can from, the poster boy or, the villain or whatever. That's my 2 pennyworth.
Any more questions?
Does it make sense to work exclusively as a paid worker in charity sector, or should we be encouraging people to carry on with their business, job, whatever, and spare some time and money, not just money, but spare some time for charity activities? What do you say to that?
What do you think?
Yeah. So in actual fact, those who attended the workshop number 2, I don't know if there are anybody from workshop number 2. Yes, I see a few people. Kevin was actually talking about the fact that Network Rare, with 38,000 people, allow employees to have 5 voluntary leave days per year. So think about it. 38,000, 5 days. It's a lot of time. But one of the challenges we discovered recently was many people don't necessarily know what to do, and we, as the voluntary sector, are not going in with our checklist to ask them to see if we can match their personal interests with with our needs. And most recently, in October, I was involved in organizing the Hate Crime Week in Milton Keynes. So we needed, as a small fledgling organization, we needed somebody to help us with, writing a press release. And in actual fact, through Kevin, a colleague of his came on board and agreed to do it for us as one of his one day. And, he managed to get us on some of the local radios and so on. So he did his best. Then we could focus on the other issues we were dealing with. So certainly, yes, it's not an either or. But at the same time, I don't think the voluntary sector can rely only on volunteers when the people who are giving money, the little money there is, are into logical frameworks and those forms which people have to fill. I don't think the volunteers will have the time to do the kind of work they need to secure money from the powers that be. So, I don't think there is one way or the other, but definitely we have to do more with the private sector.
just on the employee-sponsored volunteering side, the things that I've picked up from charities that have told me about their experience of this is firstly, yes, this point about actually being confident enough to say this is what we need rather than waiting to be told what the volunteers would like to do. Being confident about an expectation that there will be a degree of mission alignment, that you expect your volunteers to be interested in not only the activity but also who you are and what you stand for, and that matters and will seep into the way you expect them to conduct themselves as volunteers. To try to develop a relationship that will continue over time rather than to have lots of different people and organisations coming in a sort of ad hoc way. And yes, to say we'd love to work with you, but we want a commitment over time so that we get to know you, and then that translates back into this business about mission alignment and forming a kind of strong relationship that can then support the organisation, probably in other more unexpected ways. So,
Brilliant, thank you. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to go straight to the middle there, and then I'm going to wrap up. So, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my name's Dawn Clark. I'm the fundraising manager at Willand Hospice. We're one of those in-between charities. We need £6 million to deliver services free of charge, and we have 500 volunteers. And we've really tried to understand why people volunteer, because you can't presume they do it because they want to do good. Some people do it because it's social. And I just wondered if you've done research on why people volunteer, because you can then build the relationship to that person, to what motivates them to volunteer. Because we couldn't run the hospice without them. We do have to have paid staff because we need to have the right skills, whether that's clinical or fundraising. But those volunteers are vital. And I just wondered, with your research, what you've found.
So I guess the main reaction to that is that we have not done a great deal of research around volunteering and motivations for volunteering. A big part of that is, I guess partly it goes back to my presentation earlier where I was talking about some of my own motivations for doing research and my own sort of agenda around research connected to the voluntary sector. And volunteering and all of the issues around volunteering is such a big field in and of itself, and there's academic conferences devoted to volunteering. So I guess part of that answer is that we haven't done a great deal of research within CVSL, but we're very aware of it as an issue that is very connected to the leadership part of our agenda as well. So we have a lot of conversations with organisations that are sort of in that field of volunteering. And one of those is, he's not here today unfortunately, but Ronald, one of our PhD students, is exactly going through the process of creating a course on volunteer management with Volunteering Scotland. I'm allowed to say that, it's not a secret, it's a really kind of open process that he's going through. That will hopefully result in a course that's part of our kind of portfolio of courses. So obviously a great deal of research has gone into the kind of background to that. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about the really interesting and quite complex linkages that are sort of behind a lot of this, like the conversations that are going on with different groups and different agencies and so on. I'm sure Leila will be able to say more about volunteering, but it also just so happens that you're sitting next to a real expert on volunteering, Angela. So you've probably had that conversation, but Angela knows a great deal about volunteering. And it's just so interesting that those different bodies of knowledge often quite sort of kind of sit alongside each other and not always in dialogue as much as they should be actually. And obviously the whole issue of leadership and management is very connected to management and leadership within volunteers. Although I do have to say that in our Lloyds Bank work we've come across and spoken to a lot of volunteers in the course of that research. And we've sort of framed it as a key part of the social value that these charities are creating. And indeed, you will be doing exactly that because obviously volunteering is so embedded in your organisation, just like so many other organisations, and that's a form of social value. So we've been kind of kicking that debate around a bit, haven't we? And, but I will pass over to you quickly.
So one of the things that I'm working on at the moment alongside the work for Lloyds is an inquiry into, it's kind of rather broad, an inquiry into the kinds of support that communities might require, might want in the future to feel and be powerful given the context that we are all living in at the moment. And one of the things that we tried to unpick quite early on was motivation to be involved in communities, and all of that is published in a nice set of infographics that I had nothing to do with, but it sets out. But one of the things that was quite interesting for us, and then links across into something else that I personally think I find very helpful with thinking about volunteering, was how much people talked about what somebody, a mother, grandmother, important individual, often a relative but not always, what they had done and what that had instilled in them about getting involved in their community. That was really, really important, and what that... So there are a number of other motivations that are kind of getting angry, feeling passionate about something. Some of those bubble up and die away. And then the other thing that's really helpful, so those are all available on the... I'm not plugging, I'm just giving information, on the IVAR website. But the other thing that was done quite a while ago, but I still think stands as one of the most useful pieces of work really around, is the Pathways Through Participation research, which was funded by the Big Lottery Fund. It was done in collaboration between 3 organisations, and it still stands up as one of the most important and helpful and practically useful pieces of work about participation in community. And one of the really important lessons of that was that people's participation will ebb and flow. And lots of volunteer programs are kind of are built on the idea that somebody, the usual thing, I mean, I've been a volunteer lots, and people say, we don't mind how little you do, but you make a commitment and you do that in the way that you've agreed to do. If it's once a week, then that's what you do, and that's great. But one of the things that came through the Pathways research really strongly was how much people's volunteering or their participation in their community, and I appreciate they're slightly different things, tracked their life experience. So things might prompt them to get back involved, but equally they might pull them away from their participation. So that sort of relationship with volunteers somehow needs to kind of work with the grain of the fact that people move in and out of volunteering depending on what else is going on in their lives. And I think lots of organisations I know seem to find that very helpful because it's a kind of practical thing to work with.